Can you give us a brief summary of Hello, Goodbye, and Everything in Between?
So my new book, Hello, Goodbye, and Everything in Between, is about a couple that's been together for 2 years, and it's the night before they leave for college, and they're going to schools on opposite ends of the country, but they haven't decided whether or not they're going to break up yet. So they basically spend their last 12 hours together on sort of a scavenger hunt of places that meant something to the relationship. The site of their first kiss, their first date, the first time they met, the first time they spoke, as they try to come to a decision and decide what they're going to do.
Do you keep any characteristics in mind when you develop your characters, your main couple pairings throughout all of your books? Are there certain characteristics or traits that you keep in mind when you develop them?
You know, the way that I write, I get to know my characters as I go. I actually don't plot out my books ahead of time, which is a little bit unusual. So as I'm writing my first draft, I feel like with every decision my characters make, with every fork in the road, with every obstacle that comes their way, I learn a little bit about them. So generally what happens is by the end of the book, the characters are really who they are, and the most work that I end up doing in a revision is to go back to the beginning and to really fill in, because when you go back and read the beginning, when you write that way, oftentimes you don't even recognize the characters in the first few chapters because you really are just kind of figuring out as you go along. So I don't really set out in any particular way to say, this character is this way and this character is that way. It really develops kind of organically as I write the book.
Well, it's interesting that you say that you don't outline it, because a lot of your books manipulate time. Geometry, me, and statistical probability all take place in very specific periods of time. So if you don't, how's your process with that if you don't outline it?
Yes, as somebody who uses short time frames often in my books, you would think it would make a lot of sense for me to actually plan the books out ahead of time, but I don't. It does get really tricky when you're writing books like statistical probability that take place over 24 hours, or books like the new one, Hello, Goodbye, and Everything in Between, which takes place over 12 hours, because oftentimes I'll get to hour 9 and realize that I've used up the whole plot. Or on the flip side, in statistical probability, I remember being so worried about fitting everything in, and I got to a certain point and realized that I had a lot more time left. So it would make more sense to plot things out. It is hard. The time structure actually helps me a little bit because it does create kind of mileposts in the story, and as I'm writing and feeling my way through it, those are good guidelines. But there's a great quote by the late great E.L. Doctorow, who said it's something like writing is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as the headlight, but somehow that's enough to get you all the way home. And that really accurately describes my writing style. It's I know generally where I want the characters to end up. I know where home is, and I can usually see as far as the next chapter. I usually know kind of where they're going next, but there's a lot of darkness in between, and it is really a matter of feeling my way through and figuring out as I go.
And on a similar note, with seeing where your characters end up, do you know what their story is after the last page? Do they live beyond your mind? Do you have ideas of how things end up, or do they kind of live independently after you've told their story? And I guess a follow-up is, are there any couples or relationships that you ever feel like you'd like to revisit?
Yeah, I am always sort of jealous of authors like J.K. Rowling, for example, who's always tweeting about what her characters are up to nowadays. And for me, when I write the last page of the book, it's usually done. I don't know what it is. I mean, I think if I sat and really thought about it, I have ideas of where I would like to think my characters are, and I'm very fond of all of them, so I'd like to believe they're happy. But I really, once the book is over and I write that last page, that's kind of it for me. So I get asked about sequels a lot, and partly it's because my books tend to end, I always joke, with a sort of ellipses instead of an exclamation point. I do like to leave them a little bit open-ended so that the reader can come to a decision themselves about what they think happened to the characters. But I did, for the first time recently, I wrote a short ebook novella sequel to This Is What Happy Looks Like, called Happy Again, and it was really interesting. I had not intended to do that when I wrote the book. I had actually not intended for years. I mean, the book came out a couple years ago, and I got so many requests for a sequel, and I always said, I have no plans. And then all of a sudden one day, I was on a plane, and I just, this image of these two characters a year later popped into my head, and it's so unusual for me. I'm not one of those writers like J.K. Rowling who has Harry walking through her head and it just comes to you. But there was a question in my mind about them and about where they were, and I wanted to explore it. So I think, if it happens like that, if it happens kind of organically, then it feels like it's the right thing to do, is to continue the story. And though much to people's disappointment, that stayed just as open-ended even in the sequel, I think, than in the original. It just told a little bit more of the story.
I also have it might be a little bit complicated, but do you feel like all of your books exist within the same universe, so to speak? Because they're all contemporary romance, so do you feel like they're all living in alternate universes of today, or do, Hadley and Oliver live in the same period of time as, say, Owen from Geography?
Sure.
Like, do they live in simultaneous places just at the different times, or do you think of them as being completely separate worlds, even though the locations may be similar?
That's a great question. I do think that all my books and all my characters sort of exist in a similar universe. I think that if you put them all together, all the main characters from the various books, that they would, all get along. I mean, maybe that's something I should try writing at some point. Set all of the characters at a party and see what happens. But yeah, no, I do think, they all take place in different locations, so they're not really running into each other, but I do think of it as kind of, one universe, and they could very well bump into each other. And I always admire authors like, Sarah Dessen and Stephanie Perkins, who do that really well, who kind of have cameos from characters in other books. And so I guess there is, just enough of a separation for me that I haven't done that. But it would be fun to try at some point, because I do think they all sort of exist in a similar area.
Okay, so for those who haven't read any of your books yet, do you have a recommended jumping off point or a starting point or a reading order that you would recommend to people?
So if for people who haven't read my books yet, I think you can really start anywhere. It kind of depends on what hooks you, and that's one of the, I always like to hear from readers. When sort of a new potential reader asks me this question, I always throw it back to other readers and ask, what's your favorite? Where would you start? I think people, maybe it's just out of habit, or maybe it's just chronology, but they do tend to go in the order that they were published. I think a lot of people do start with statistical probability and kind of move on from there. But I think that this new book, Hello, Goodbye, and Everything in Between, is probably the most similar to statistical probability, in that it's a short time frame, and it's kind of an intense walking and talking. I always think of these books as, in some ways, slight tributes to the movies Before Sunrise and Before Sunset, and I think that more so than Happy and Geography, Hello, Goodbye is similar to Stat. So I think people who loved that one will probably might want to go to Hello, Goodbye next.
Just like, I actually started with This Is What Happy Looks Like
Yeah.
2 years ago,
Yeah.
and then I binge read Geography and then Statistical right after each other.
So you went in a totally
So I
different
went in a completely different
Yeah.
direction, and then I kind of got thrown off because of all the time manipulation.
Yeah.
So Geography takes place over like hours and hours, and then Statistical was like crammed into like
I
a
know.
day. And I was like,
I
oh my
know.
God, what's happening?
Geography is definitely the most far-flung in terms of, geography, but also time. Yeah.
So, how is your writing or your writing process influenced by your job as an editor?
Yeah, well, so up until, I actually left my job as an editor really recently. So up until about 5 months ago, I was also an editor for adult books at Random House, and it's a job that I completely loved, and it was really, really hard to finally make the decision to leave, just because I never thought of it as a day job. It was always another career, and I got so much out of working with authors, and I'm so proud of the books that I published there. But I, as my own career started to grow, it became harder to juggle the two, and so I did leave. I think, though, that I am a much better writer for being an editor, and I was a much better editor for being a writer. They're two jobs where you learn so much. You can't read that many manuscripts, the good ones and the bad ones, and the ones that need a lot of work and the ones that only need fine tuning, and not have that benefit your own work. And I think every book I worked on kind of contributed to my own in some way, and I learned something from each one, whether it was about plotting or voice or structure. And so it was an invaluable experience, and I do miss it a bit, although it's really nice also to be able to 100% focus on my own writing.
is there any part of the writing process that you absolutely dread, whether it be plotting or some sort of, like, oh my god, this part's coming up, how am I going to write this? Like,
Yeah.
is there a part of the process that you absolutely dread the most, and then what do you look forward to most?
So because I'm not a big plotter, that's always the hardest part for me. I am always very jealous of those authors who have tons and tons of ideas, and they're always like, oh, I can't, I don't have time to write all the books that I want to write, because that's the hardest part for me, is first coming up with an idea. And when I'm working on a book, I sort of have blinders on. I can't think yet about what the next book's going to be, so there's always this like month or two of blind panic when I finish a book, where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to think of something else to write. So that's the hardest part for me, is the initial idea. Once I have that, I actually enjoy the kind of process of unraveling it and figuring out what it's going to be. My favorite part is definitely writing dialogue. As you might be able to tell from the books, they're pretty dialogue heavy, but there's something so much fun about writing banter and just the back and forth. And when you're writing dialogue, you generally, it's easier for me to lose myself in the scene versus, I always call it kind of like connective tissue scenes, where you're trying to move the story forward. And though dialogue does that too, it just feels like it happens in a more natural way. So it's always fun.
I kind of want to ask one question that's sort of themed per
Sure.
your previous books. So, taking off the statistical probability, is it better to have a good thing and lost it, or to never have had it at all?
So this quote from Statistical Probability, is it better to have a good thing and lose it, or to never have had it at all, is actually a Charles Dickens quote that's in the book, which so many people accidentally attribute to me online, and I feel, like I just want to set the record straight. I did not write those lines. But it's, so that really, I'm a huge Dickens nerd. I love him. I've read so many of his books. I did a senior seminar of him in college, and that quote is something that I had underlined in a book that I read in college, and had, was always something in my mind. And I think every book starts with a question in a way, and that was one of the central questions for Statistical Probability. I think it's a hard answer. I would say I think it's better to have had something and lost it than to never have had it at all. But it's something that Hadley, the main character, struggles with throughout the book.
Jumping off from This Is What Happy Looks Like,
Yeah.
if you were to accidentally email a celebrity, who would you want it to be and why?
Jeez. That's a great question. If I were to accidentally email a celebrity, who would I want it to be? Probably a comedian, because, speaking of banter, I feel like you need something, I like kind of, probably somebody like Seth Meyers or Amy Poehler or Jimmy Fallon, or, somebody who would spark a good, interesting conversation. But the best kind of accident.
So, for geography and me, would you rather go everywhere or somewhere with capital S?
That's a good question. Yeah, so in geography, one of the questions that Owen and Lucy sort of struggle with is, would you like the idea of wanting to go everywhere or wanting to be somewhere with a capital S, somewhere important to them? And I'm in a period of my life right now where going everywhere is a big priority for me. I love to travel. I do it quite a lot. I really enjoy it. But of course, in the book, they're always searching for the idea of home and the idea of that somewhere with a capital S. So I think, there's something to be said for hope.
And just trying to wrap it up with some fun questions.
Yeah.
Who was your first literary crush?
Oh.
Could either be an author or a character or both.
Oh gosh. Let's see. The first books I remember just being completely obsessed with were actually the Black Stallion books. I was a total horse kid, and that was the first time I had read a series in the way that you gobble up a series when you're a kid, and so that was definitely, those were kind of the books that stand out for me when I was, pretty young.
And lastly, what thought or message would you write into a fortune cookie?
Oh, everything happens for a reason. Thank you.
Those were great questions.
Yeah, those were really great.
I tried so hard.
They were really good.
Any general messages for your fans?
I I am just always so grateful. I have the best readers and the best fans, and I am so excited about this new book, so I'm like looking forward to other people discovering it too. So thank you.
Thank you.
Those were really fantastic.